Welcome to the Hunchcast, where we discuss all things the Hunchback of Notre Dame. I'm Leslie.
And I'm Patrick, and today we're discussing Universal Pictures' The Hunchback of Notre Dame, released in 1923, directed by Wallace Worsley and starring Lon Chaney, Patsy Ruth Miller, Norman Kerry, and Brandon Hurst.
1923, that's over 100 years ago. Pat, is this the first film adaptation ever made of Victor Hugo's novel?
Oh, not by a long shot.
Really?
There had been adaptations for about 20 years at this point, more or less ever since movies were invented. The earliest adaptation is from 1905, directed by a woman, actually, so not just with the opera we talked about last week, La Esmeralda by Louise Bertin, but the film Esmeralda from 1905, directed by Alice Guy Blanche, was the first adaptation, and it was thought to be lost, like so many silent films are, but it was found and put online about a year or so ago. It's a similar story with another adaptation from 1911, which was also a French film, and there were a few other ones throughout the 19-teens and early 1920s. It's not even the first American movie based on the novel. The earliest I could find was a movie from 1917 by Fox Studios. That wasn't even made in Hollywood. It was made in New Jersey. That's how old the film industry was. We didn't even have the idea that you make movies in California.
I think that's a great segue into our minute of history. Who was responsible for pitching the idea of another Hunchback of Notre Dame movie to a Hollywood-based movie studio?
Universal was technically a Hollywood movie studio, but it wasn't one of the major ones.
Yeah, they were a second-tier studio, right? They did not have the money that MGM or Warner Brothers had at the time.
No, they were cranking out cheap fodder for your local Nickelodeon theaters, right? Westerns, comedies, things that don't cost a lot of money. But there was a desire around Universal to be more prestigious, to be like Warner Brothers or especially MGM. And there had been several attempts to make another American adaptation of Hugo's novel, but it came to Universal in a bit of a convoluted way. The star of the movie, the actor who plays Quasimodo and is certainly the most memorable part, is an actor named Lon Chaney.
Yes, the man of 1,000 faces. Listener, if you're not familiar with that name, I would describe him as the Bill Skarsgård of his day, in that he was the character actor of the silent film era. In addition to playing Quasimodo, he also played the Phantom of the Opera for Universal a couple years later.
Ah, did Mr. Skarsgård do all of his own makeup designs?
Well, I know that at this time, during this period of Hollywood history, the idea of a movie studio hiring a designated makeup artist was unheard of. So actors were expected to do and supply their own makeup, even if that makeup job required the use of prosthetics. So, listener, that makeup you see on Quasimodo in this movie, Lon Chaney designed that himself and applied it all by hand every single day.
And that's really what made Lon Chaney stand out as an actor. He wasn't a big star. He got into acting after years of doing material on the stage. He was all about being a character actor and not always being the handsome leading man, which is why he was attracted to the idea of playing Quasimodo. And he worked with Universal a ton throughout the 19-teens and the early 1920s. And he hated it. Universal was not just cheap with their budgets, they were also cheap with their actors. Chaney knew his worth. He wanted some more money. And so he wanted to pool his cash together, get some investors involved, and finance a really prestigious, awesome production of The Hunchback of Notre Dame. There was talks of, maybe we could film in Europe, we can get so-and-so to direct it, but that falls through. And even though it's Chaney's idea, he's not enough of a star to bankroll a huge epic movie by himself. And around the same time, there's a really young employee at Universal named Irving Thalberg, who, like Chaney, is a fan of Hugo's book. Thalberg had a lot of health problems from his youth and spent a lot of his childhood sick in bed. He couldn't play outside, so he would read. And he was enthralled reading The Hunchback of Notre Dame and thought it would make a great movie once he got older. Well, he was older, Universal needed a hit, all these factors come together, and eventually, early 1922, start of 23, Universal decides they're going to make their own adaptation of The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And unlike all of their other movies, those cheap westerns and pie-in-the-face comedies, The Hunchback of Notre Dame would be prestigious. I'm talking huge grand sets, hundreds of extras, big costumes. It was as expensive as any movie could be back then. It was one of the most expensive films ever by the time it was released in 1923. And Universal had a special term for these expensive productions. They were called super jewels, right? This is not just a movie, it's a super jewel.
That's Jewel, listener, not the other one.
No, Quasimodo was not a vape god. When Chaney was trying to get the movie produced independently, there was talks that maybe he would be the one to direct it. And ultimately, Universal did not go with Chaney.
What, so he would be the executive producer, the writer, the director, and the star? What, is he Tommy Wiseau?
I think he's a little bit better than Tommy Wiseau, because a lot of this movie more or less was directed by Lon Chaney. Universal went with a work-for-hire guy, Wallace Worsley, who Chaney did not hate, but also did not love. Lon Chaney is showing up on his days off, more or less to do some backseat directing with Worsley, especially scenes involving Esmeralda.
Yeah, in Patsy Ruth Miller's memoir, which is called My Hollywood, When Both of Us Were Young, she claims that Lon Chaney directed most of the movie, and she didn't care for Wallace Worsley either.
No, and movies were still finding their voice in 1923. You know, the idea of a movie being a feature-length experience that's more than an hour was pretty recent. You know, A Birth of a Nation, which is kind of the first modern movie, only came out in 1915. There's a lot of experimenting going on, and while we can pick on Wallace Worsley a little bit and some of the uncreative shots going on, movies were still trying to figure out how to be movies. But what is this movie about, Leslie?
I thought you'd never ask, Patrick. Our story takes place in Paris in 1482, where the citizens are celebrating the Festival of Fools. We're introduced to the disfigured bell ringer of Notre-Dame Cathedral, Quasimodo, played by Lon Chaney. Rejected by society, Quasimodo scorns the Parisians and serves only two entities, Notre-Dame and his master, Jehan Frollo, played by Brandon Hurst, who is the younger brother of the cathedral's archdeacon, Don Claudio, or Dom Claude, depending on what title card you're looking at, played by Nigel de Brullier. As the tyrannical King Louis XI makes his way through the crowd, Clopin, played by Ernest Torrance, the king of the beggars and Paris's uncrowned monarch, speaks with Jehan of a day when they will bow their heads to no man. Later that night, Quasimodo, having been crowned the King of Fools by the Parisians, is treated to a performance by Clopin's adoptive daughter, the beautiful dancer Esmeralda, played by Patsy Ruth Miller. The next day, the king's new captain of the guard, Phoebus, played by played by Norman Kerry, visits his fiancée, Fleur-de-Lis, and spots Esmeralda from her balcony, immediately becoming attracted to the dancer. Jehan, too, longs to possess Esmeralda, and he orders Quasimodo to abduct her while she walks home. Phoebus comes to Esmeralda's rescue, arresting Quasimodo while Jehan escapes. Phoebus brings Esmeralda to a seedy tavern in the hopes that she might become his mistress, but after she opens up to him about her status as an orphan, he comes to respect and pity her, and he chivalrously escorts her home. Later that night, poet Gringoire, played by Raymond Hatton, strays too close to the Court of Miracles, the city of thieves where Clopin rules. Gringoire is mistaken for an aristocratic spy and sentenced to be hanged. However, Esmeralda stops the hanging by imploring her father, "Have you so little misery that you must create more? Cut him down, I say." "You go, girl." The next day, Quasimodo is publicly flogged for attempting to kidnap Esmeralda. When he laments his thirst, only Esmeralda takes pity on him and gives him a drink of water. Later, Phoebus invites Esmeralda to accompany him to a ball hosted by Fleur-de-Lis's aunt in honor of his promotion. Phoebus has Esmeralda change into a beautiful gown, and he escorts her to the ballroom and introduces her to his guests as Her Highness the Princess of Egypt. Clopin and his people storm the ball, forbidding a relationship between a vagabond and an aristocrat. Heartbroken, Esmeralda leaves with her father. The next day, Jehan approaches Clopin with a proposition. In exchange for Esmeralda's hand in marriage, he will give Clopin half of the treasure of Notre-Dame, whatever that is, it's never explained. Clopin is initially intrigued by this offer, as he believes he can use the treasure to lift his people out of poverty, but he ultimately turns Jehan down, saying, "The hour for an uprising is not yet." Phoebus and Esmeralda meet in Notre-Dame's courtyard for one last farewell. The romantic encounter is interrupted, however, when Jehan stabs Phoebus and disappears into the night. Esmeralda is blamed for the crime and brought to court, where she tries to expose Jehan as the true attacker, but she ultimately confesses to the stabbing under torture. Jehan visits Esmeralda while she's in prison awaiting execution and tells her Phoebus has died of his wounds. He confesses his love and asks Esmeralda to leave with him, but she scorns him and sends him away. On the day of Esmeralda's execution, Quasimodo swings down from the bell tower, throws Esmeralda over his shoulder, and runs into the church, crying "Sanctuary!" as Don Claudio, the archdeacon, forbids the king's soldiers from rushing in after her. Shortly after, Jehan tells Clopin that King Louis XI has ordered Esmeralda to be removed from the cathedral and hanged immediately. Clopin and the vagabonds take this as a sign that the hour for revolution is here, and they rally Paris's entire lower class to storm the cathedral and sack the city. Gringoire visits Phoebus, who is not dead, and tells him Esmeralda is alive and living safely in Notre-Dame. Meanwhile, the approaching mob wakes Esmeralda. She doesn't recognize her family and friends, and misunderstanding their intentions, she implores Quasimodo to defend the cathedral, especially after the king's guard joins the conflict and kills Clopin. While Quasimodo is distracted, Jehan sneaks into the cathedral and grabs Esmeralda, attempting to force himself on her. Quasimodo rushes in and fights Jehan off, throwing him off of Notre-Dame, but not before Jehan fatally stabs him in the back. Phoebus rushes in and embraces Esmeralda, and the two leave the cathedral arm in arm. Meanwhile, Quasimodo rings the bells of Notre-Dame one last time before taking his final breath, and the credits roll.
There's a lot going on here. You mentioned this takes place in 1482.
Yes, sir.
You had to do a bit of math to figure that out. Because when I'm watching this movie, I see a title card. After all, this is a silent movie. There's no spoken dialogue. Anytime a character speaks, there is a card that appears with the dialogue so the audience can understand. There are way too many title cards in this movie. A silent film should embody the idea that you show and do not tell the story. These title cards are often unnecessary and way too complicated. Although occasionally, I do appreciate the overwritten, overly medievalized dialogue of Pierre Portrayal, the scenario writer who also wrote a lot of Pulp Fiction adventure stories, and he wrote an adaptation of this movie as a short novel. So if you want to read a abridged version of Hugo in the style of a Tarzan novel, be my guest. Now, instead of saying in the year 1482, there was a creature known as the Hunchback of Notre Dame, there's a title card saying, 10 years before Columbus discovered America, there lived within the rocky fastness of the cathedral a creature whom the Parisians of that day knew as the Hunchback of Notre Dame. If you do not know that in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue, you're going to have no idea when this movie takes place. It's a math problem.
Honestly, Patrick, I've only seen a handful of silent films. I haven't seen nearly as many as you have. I don't have a very strong point of comparison. I honestly found the title cards fine.
I just think a lot of the time the audience can see what's going on. They don't need to be explicitly told with a sentence on the screen saying that whatever is happening is sad.
Well, in that sense, I don't think this would be a bad first silent film for someone who's never seen a silent film before and isn't familiar with the format.
No, not at all. You know, it's a familiar story. There's plenty of cards and plenty of action. Yeah, this is a good first silent movie.
Well, is this a familiar story? Because I thought that Quasimodo's master was a man named Claude Frollo. In this movie, he's Jehan Frollo, but he's not the Jehan Frollo that we know from the book?
Not really. This is the first of a few adaptations that are going to split the character of Claude Frollo in two. The character's religious qualities are going to be given to the Archdeacon of Notre Dame, and the character's negative qualities are going to be given to a secular character. In this case, Jehan, who, instead of being a rowdy student, is instead just some guy, at least in the version of the movie that we have today. Because, like so many silent films, what we have to watch is only a partial view of the original movie that came out in 1923.
So there were entire scenes and subplots that were cut, you're saying?
When this movie was first released, it was part of a roadshow presentation, which in modern terms you can think of like the movie equivalent of when Broadway musicals go from city to city. It was a touring production. It was a luxurious experience. You had to pay more money per ticket. There were programs, and the movie was longer. You know, there were live musicians who would play along. You know, silent movies were never silent. There was always somebody playing along, even if it was just on a piano. And the original version was well over 2 hours, and there were a ton of subplots, including ones that actually explain who the heck this Jehan Frollo guy is.
Yeah, he is the brother of the Archdeacon, which I guess is why he's able to keep Quasimodo in the bell tower, who, speaking of which, in the novel, Quasimodo is Frollo's adoptive son. Frollo adopts Quasimodo when he's a toddler, teaches Quasimodo to read, teaches him to speak, gives him a job. Maybe he doesn't feel a large amount of fatherly affection toward Quasimodo, but he does still feel some sort of obligation over him. In this movie, Quasimodo is described multiple times as Jehan Frollo's slave. They do use the term slave several times. Not servant, not ward, not son, slave. It's pretty brutal.
Jehan was supposed to be, like Claude in the novel, an alchemist. There were scenes filmed early on that showed Claude condemning Jehan for practicing alchemy because it's not a very Christian idea. And more importantly, you mentioned the treasure of Notre Dame.
Yes, Jehan goes to his buddy Clopin, which I really like their friendship.
It reminds me of the relationship between Claude Frollo and Clopin from Louise Bertin's Esmeralda opera, except here it actually makes sense and isn't stupid.
Yeah, it's never explained how they met or why they're friends or what either of them are getting out of this friendship. I guess it's because they have the same goal. They both want to overthrow the king and crush the French aristocracy, but they both have differing motivations. Clopin, as the king of the beggars, wants to lift his people out of poverty. Jehan, it seems, just is a greedy person and wants to possess wealth and possess Esmeralda.
Again, you mentioned possess wealth. There was a whole subplot that no longer exists. All of the footage is gone, but there are a few photographs, and we still have the original script, the shooting script that talks about it, there was a literal physical treasure inside of Notre Dame that Jehan was scheming to get at, like a pirate in some old cartoon.
X marks the spot under the altar, I guess?
Well, I thought it was ridiculous, but, well, listener, Leslie and I just got back from Paris a few weeks ago, and while we were exploring the interior of Notre Dame, we found an area where there is supposed to be a literal treasure. They use the word treasure. Now, I don't know if it's a coincidence, but as soon as I saw that there was a treasure room, I immediately thought to this lost subplot from the 1923 movie of the secret treasure of Notre Dame. Clopin wants it, Jehan wants it, Claude is trying to protect it. There's a lot of ink in the script about this treasure of Notre Dame. Almost all of it is gone from the movie, and I don't think that's such a bad thing. I would love for these scenes to turn up one day, but I don't think the movie as it exists today in its shorter form with a bunch of missing scenes, because this is a movie that's 100 years old, it's not in perfect condition, I don't think we're that much worse for wear.
You said you hope the scenes turn up one day. How would they turn up one day? You know, do these scenes exist in some form, somewhere?
It's possible that a collector or an archivist somewhere, whether in the United States or in another country like Japan or Brazil or the UK, has a copy of the movie that includes the lost scenes, but they just haven't digitized it or preserved it or told anybody. While 90% of silent films are lost to history, they've degraded or they've been destroyed in fires, this was such a popular movie. I think there's a decent chance that at least a few of these lost scenes, and we'll talk about them as we go, are going to turn up.
Speaking of things that are lost, let's talk about this movie's set, because obviously this was not shot in Paris. Paris, even in the 1920s, looked too modern and too far removed from the medieval setting that the producers wanted. So an entire set was built on Universal's backlot in Hollywood. This recreation of medieval Paris, including Notre Dame's facade, a city square, the Court of Miracles. Part of the reason why this movie cost so much money is because those sets were made to last. The studio executive said, okay, we have to build these really expensive sets anyway. Let's make them as high quality as possible so we can reuse them for future films. And I know these sets were used in movies until the 1960s when they were destroyed in a fire.
Yeah, many of the sets were destroyed, but a few of them were built back. The facade of Notre Dame, which was really only built up through the Gallery of the Kings region, so about 20 feet up in the cathedral, they didn't rebuild that. That was burned, and they just gave up.
Wait, so they only built about the first 20 feet?
Yeah.
Then why is it that we can see the entire cathedral in the movie?
Well, for close-up shots, they did build small sections of like the upper gallery or the balcony when you see Quasimodo looking down and making faces. But for the shots where you see the entirety of the cathedral, that's just a model that is hung over the camera. And it's not even a complete scale model of the cathedral. It's just the part of the church above that first 20 feet. And because, you know, when you mess around with a camera lens, you don't get the same sense of perspective that you do in real life. When the little cathedral is held in front of the camera, and it matches up perfectly with the Gallery of the Kings in that first 20 feet of the facade, it looks seamless. It looks like the real building.
See, this is the filmmaking wizardry that we lost with the advent of CGI.
Nowadays, they would just hand it off to some studio in India and say, hey, buddy, you got 10 seconds to do this CGI for one nickel. Otherwise, I'm going to blacklist your company in all of Hollywood.
Speaking of Notre Dame, the central conflict of this film is pretty far removed from the original purpose of Victor Hugo's novel. Victor Hugo wrote Notre-Dame de Paris, aka The Hunchback of Notre Dame, at a time when people didn't really care about architectural preservation the way they do today. We've already talked about this extensively in previous episodes of this podcast, listener, but basically, Enlightenment thinkers didn't care about preserving quote-unquote old buildings. They wanted to knock those old buildings down and replace them with modern marvels that reflected how far they had come intellectually and technologically. But Victor Hugo and his fellow romantics believed that these quote-unquote old buildings united us with a mutual cultural identity. They were our history standing before us. And Victor Hugo wrote The Hunchback of Notre Dame, at least in part, to advocate for the restoration of these old buildings. And it worked. His novel revived public interest in Notre Dame Cathedral to the point where the French government funded a huge, very expensive restoration project. So Victor Hugo's novel is the reason why, Pat, you and I were able to visit Notre Dame Cathedral a couple weeks ago and stare at it with eyes glistening and jaws hung open, marveling at how wonderful it is. So the novel's original purpose was fulfilled long before the 1920s. What do we do with the story now? If we don't have to make a movie about why it's important to care about old buildings, because people already care about old buildings, what do we do with the story? Well, we reinterpret it. And this movie reinterprets the story as being about a class war. On one hand, you have King Louis XI and the French aristocracy tyrannizing marginalized groups. On the other hand, you have Clopin, the king of the beggars, who dreams of lifting his people out of poverty and overthrowing the French aristocracy. And caught in the middle of it all is this forbidden romance between Esmeralda, Clopin's daughter, and Phoebus, the captain of the king's guard. He represents the highest of the high, she represents the lowest of the low. They want to be together, but because this class conflict is coming to a head, they can't.
Irving Thalberg did not pitch this movie as being about architectural preservation or the decline of the Ancien Regime in favor of modernity and the Enlightenment. He pitched it to Universal as a love story.
That's exactly what we get here, this more economically informed version of Romeo and Juliet, this forbidden love between people of two very different backgrounds.
You say economically informed, I say politically informed. I might be stretching here, but I really see the politics of this movie when it comes to class and the rise of the vagabonds versus the aristocrats as a reflection of the Russian Revolution. I mean, the Soviet Union was fully formed a year before this movie was released in 1922, and there was a huge concern amongst many Americans about communism and socialism.
Yeah, let's talk about that. It's, at least in my opinion, unclear at the end of the movie whether the vagabonds achieve their goal. You know, they mobilize, the entire lower class gets together, they storm the streets of Paris, they ransack the city, and they storm the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Even though Notre Dame and the Catholic Church kind of float above this class conflict, in this movie, the Catholic Church is very much a bastion of good. I mean, just after Quasimodo was done being flogged, the archdeacon runs out of the cathedral, rushes up to Quasimodo, and unshackles him. I mean, we literally see someone who represents the church unshackling somebody from the bonds of oppression. I mean, hello. How obvious could you get?
Like with splitting Claude Frollo into the good religious character and the evil secular character, I see that as yet another decision to portray religion a lot more positively than Victor Hugo did. This movie is not going to leave any questions about the quote-unquote uselessness of God that Hugo talks about. This is an explicitly pro-Christian movie, and I would even say a pro-Catholic movie.
Absolutely. This is the most pro-Catholic Church film I have ever seen.
And yes, there were censorship boards, mostly at the local level. The famous Hays Code was not yet in effect, but certain cities did reserve the right to, ban certain movies from being played. And around the time that Hunchback came out, there were concerns, especially from certain Lon Chaney movies, like The Penalty, of portrayals of violence and crime and bad guys getting away with their crimes. No such ambiguity is found in this movie, and while nowadays we can roll our eyes at the extremely positive portrayal of the church, at least in comparison to the novel, right? I'm not telling anyone what their religious views should or shouldn't be, but Hugo was not the most flattering to religion in Notre-Dame de Paris.
No, absolutely not. We see the Archdeacon of Notre Dame, an incredibly powerful position within the clergy, teaching alchemy to the king and lusting after a 16-year-old girl and stabbing people. I mean, it's not a very positive view of the Catholic Church. This movie completely forgoes that very negative portrayal of a clergyman. The Archdeacon of Notre Dame, this Dom Claudio or Don Claude, depending on the title card you look at, I don't know. He is a Christ-like figure. He is a bastion of good. Often throughout the film, he is the only person who can get people to rein in their anger and choose peace. I mean, there's a very brief scene at the beginning of the movie where Clopin frustratedly pushes a woman down the stairs, and the Archdeacon runs up to him and puts his hand on Clopin's shoulder, and just a couple of words from the Archdeacon is enough to get Clopin to calm down.
Even Quasimodo respects him. They pray together, they walk around together, and as you mentioned earlier, the Archdeacon helps free Quasimodo. It's not just Esmeralda who's kind to him, but the Archdeacon as well. And while you might roll your eyes at the portrayal of religion compared to the novel, this is the Hollywood version. Of course, they're going to be a lot more approving of religion and not as negative. I think this was a bit of a bold choice in its own way at the time, because Catholics were not the most respected in the United States in 1923.
The KKK certainly didn't respect them.
Not at all. And they were associated with immigrant groups, Italians, Poles, Irishmen, a lot of people who were viewed unfavorably during this time. And Universal sought the approval of Catholic churches and nuns while making this movie. To their credit, they got what they wanted. They got the approval of several Catholic groups, nuns, and religious leaders.
Could you argue that this is one of the earliest examples of a film studio pandering to a minority group?
Oh, absolutely. And it's not like Universal was run by Catholics anyhow. The main producer on this movie, the head of Universal Studios, was a man named Carl Laemmle, who fled from Germany as a Jew being persecuted. But I wonder if that might have something to do with it. Aside from, pandering to a minority group for a quick buck, this is a minority group that wasn't super popular in America. And, maybe Mr. Laemmle knew about that as a guy who might not have been able to practice his religion or be himself in his home country. He certainly couldn't have done it a few years after this movie came out.
You briefly mentioned Quasimodo's relationship with the Archdeacon. I'd like to unpack that for a moment, because the Quasimodo in this movie has a lot more self-respect than the Quasimodo in Victor Hugo's novel. In Victor Hugo's novel, Quasimodo is loyal to his master. In the book, we would call that man Claude Frollo, but in this movie, we're calling that man Jehan Frollo. Quasimodo's loyal to that man right up until the bitter end. After Quasimodo is captured and publicly flogged for a crime his master told him to commit, Quasimodo in the book doesn't begrudge Claude Frollo that. He continues to be loyal to Frollo, he continues to serve Frollo, he continues to love Frollo. It isn't until he realizes that Frollo was responsible for Esmeralda's death, yes, listener, in the book, Esmeralda does die, that he finally turns on Frollo and throws him off of Notre Dame. In this movie, like I said, Quasimodo has a lot more self-respect. After he is publicly flogged for a crime that his master told him to commit, he completely abandons his master. We see a little scene of the two of them running into each other in Notre Dame, and Quasimodo sticks his tongue out and makes this horribly gruesome face at Jehan, and Jehan just runs away. And after that, we really don't see the two of them together. Quasimodo tends to gravitate more toward the Archdeacon, and we get to see them together approaching Esmeralda after Quasimodo rescues her and telling her, it's okay, we're going to take care of you, we're going to give you shelter and clothing, it's all right. They make a really nice team.
I like my cooler dad. He's nice and doesn't have me whipped for my crimes. Maybe Quasimodo has so much self-respect in this version because he's such an athlete. Hugo describes Quasimodo as being like a lizard or a mountain goat in the novel, just jumping around the architecture, dislodging the crows, totally athletic and in sync with the church. This movie captures that great, and while Lon Chaney did not do all of his own stunts like the publicity claims, he did a lot of them, and it's really amazing to see, again, with very limited special effects back then, you just see Lon Chaney jumping around the architecture and swinging and flicking his tongue and climbing about the projections. It's really amazing.
Yeah, he does a lot of tongue flicking in this movie. In the book, Victor Hugo writes that Quasimodo hates the general populace and scorns them. In this movie, Quasimodo is very playful in his hatred of the Parisians. One of the first shots in this movie is Quasimodo leaning over the balustrade, sticking his tongue out at the Parisians, blowing them raspberries, making faces at them. It's really fun to watch him being a troll. It really is.
To be fair, the public hates him. He's ridiculed. He's Quasimodo. He looks like he stepped right out of the pages of the novel. And whenever Lon Chaney portrayed a character from literature, he was always very careful to portray that character exactly as the author described.
Yeah, this makeup job looks almost identical to some illustrations of Quasimodo that I have seen.
And some illustrations that Lon Chaney saw. He really based the makeup not just on Hugo's description, but on illustrations, particularly those by the French artist Gustave Brion.
Well, I'm sitting here wondering how Lon Chaney is able to accomplish such cool stunts wearing that hump. I mean, that thing is huge. It looks really heavy. I had always heard that Lon Chaney's hump weighed 70 pounds.
No, it wasn't anywhere near that. I don't even think it was 20. And think about it. Lon Chaney was not a world-class athlete. He was a 40-year-old man who was acting in a movie for money. You're not going to go to work and injure your body horribly. You know, this is before method acting and all that kind of foolishness destroyed so many actors' brains. Like, why would you wear a 70-pound weight for no reason? You're just going to hurt your body and injure yourself. Now, granted, Lon Chaney did suffer some minor injuries on this movie. Having the wart over his eye kind of messed up his vision. And there's a scene where he throws Jehan Frollo to his doom. That hurt his back a little bit. But no, there's no reason why you would wear a 70-pound weight for no reason when you can just act like it's heavy. He's an actor.
You know what? You're right. That does make sense given a story Patsy Ruth Miller tells in her memoir where she's on the set of this movie and she's struggling to get through a really emotionally demanding scene. And then Lon Chaney pulls her aside and says, and I love this quote, I have it written down, "Remember, my dear, you are an actress. You do not have to live the part. You just have to act it. The point is not for you to cry, but to make your audience cry." Yeah, putting the pieces together here myself, that does not sound like something a really intense method actor who believed you had to suffer to turn in a compelling performance would say.
No, and that's because Lon Chaney was a very practical guy. He didn't give a lot of interviews, he was pretty withdrawn, and he had common sense. He gave a ton of advice to Patsy Ruth Miller. He was a bit of a mentor figure, almost a father figure, because Patsy Ruth Miller was a very young girl. She was almost the age of Esmeralda in the novel.
Yeah, she was 18. And hers is a very classic Hollywood Cinderella story. She was discovered, I think, at a party when she was 16 years old. This was her first really big role, and even though she acted for many, many years after this, she would always be known as Esmeralda from Universal's The Hunchback of Notre Dame. This was the role she was known for the rest of her life.
And it's better to be remembered for one role than to not be remembered at all. I really like this version of Esmeralda.
This might be a hot take, but this is my favorite Esmeralda, at least among all the Esmeraldas in all the adaptations I've seen, which are not nearly as many as the ones you've seen, Patrick. Patsy Ruth Miller's Esmeralda takes everything I disliked about Victor Hugo's Esmeralda and fixes it. Yes, she's still a little naive and she's still a little innocent, but she's a lot more outspoken and headstrong. I mean, take the scene where she saves Gringoire from being hanged. In the book, she saves him by offering to marry him. In the movie, she doesn't have to do that. She just runs up to her father, who she knows has a soft spot for her, and says, "Have you so little misery that you must create more? Cut him down, I say." Esmeralda in the book is not a damsel in distress by any means, and we have had pretty extensive discussions about the way she is portrayed in that novel and how it differs from the general conception that a lot of readers have of her. But I can't see Victor Hugo's Esmeralda saying something like that. I'm also really drawn to Esmeralda and Quasimodo's relationship in this movie. In the book, Esmeralda really never gets over her discomfort at Quasimodo's appearance. Even when they're living in the bell tower together, he isolates himself from her because he can tell his appearance makes her uncomfortable. In this movie, Esmeralda is totally fine with Quasimodo. I mean, she touches him, she talks to him, they have a very sweet relationship. This movie has my favorite depiction of Esmeralda and Quasimodo's first encounter, because Quasimodo is crowned the King of Fools, which, by the way, we don't get to see.
Just like the Esmeralda opera.
Right. First we see him blowing raspberries at the Parisians and expressing how much he hates them, and then the next time we see him, he's riding on their shoulders and he has a crown on him, and here I am thinking, wait, number one, why did he go down there? Number two, if he hates these people so much, why would he want to be their king? How did that happen? So I really wish we would have seen that. Was that part of the cut footage?
No, but there were scenes in that sequence, not of the actual election of the Pope of Fools or showing why Quasimodo was down there, but there were some extra scenes where Gringoire would tease Quasimodo, and then Quasimodo growls at him, and Gringoire gets very scared. A few photographs of that exist, which I absolutely adore. But no, we don't know what the King of Fools is.
Anyway, he's crowned the King of Fools, and then the vagabonds bring Esmeralda out to dance for him. And Esmeralda comes out of her little tent, and she's dancing. She doesn't notice Quasimodo at first, but when she does, she freezes. And she doesn't look scared or disgusted, at least in my opinion. It's just that she's clearly never seen someone who looks like that before, and she just needs a moment to process what she's seeing. And Quasimodo, of course, thinks that she's about to run away from him screaming, and he makes a face at her. Esmeralda snaps out of it, and playfully, she makes the same face back at him, and then she goes right back to dancing. Like nothing even happened. And Quasimodo in that moment looks shocked, frankly. I think that's the moment he fell in love with Esmeralda. I think he was cooked after that. He didn't stand a chance.
I took it that Esmeralda was snubbing his looks, and he felt very embarrassed, because you see when Esmeralda goes back to dancing, he drops his arm and he shakes his head. But we're able to have different interpretations because there's not a title card that comes up telling us what to think. We're able to see the visuals as visuals.
Listener, in our previous episode about the opera La Esmeralda, you might remember Patrick bringing up the fact that a couple years ago, the CEO of Netflix released a statement saying that he wanted to produce second screen first content. Basically, movies that constantly explain and re-explain and re-explain again what's going on in order to appeal to people who have the movie on in the background while they're playing Candy Crush on their phone or cooking dinner or folding their laundry, so that even if you're not paying complete attention to the screen, you can still understand what's going on. Silent films are not that. You know, you're not spoon-fed narration or overly obvious dialogue about what's happening. You really have to put your phone down and pay attention, and you get to have conversations like these where you talk about, oh, well, I interpreted this expression this way. Oh, no, well, I interpreted this action as this way.
Lon Chaney was a master of expression and body language.
1,000%.
After all, Lon Chaney grew up with deaf parents, and he knew sign language.
And he was able to bring that experience to the role of Quasimodo, a deaf character. I wonder if that's part of the reason why he was so drawn to this role and tried so hard to get this movie made. Pat, correct me if I'm wrong. In this movie, especially when Quasimodo is being flogged and his tunic is ripped open, we see this big, hairy lump in the middle of his chest. It's almost like a mono boob. Is that the camel's breast that Victor Hugo makes note of in the novel?
I would have to imagine. Chaney did try to get as close as he could to the description from the book, and this might be the only adaptation to have Quasimodo's mono boob.
I'll take your word for it. You've seen quite a few more than I have. Speaking of Quasimodo's flogging, I love Esmeralda's role in this scene, because in the novel, Esmeralda does give Quasimodo water, but she runs away right after he's done drinking, and he tries to express his gratitude toward her. He tries to kiss her hand, but she pulls her hand away and just darts off, because again, his appearance is too off-putting to her. In this movie, again, this is why Patsy Ruth Miller's Esmeralda is my favorite. After Quasimodo has drank to his heart's content, Esmeralda sticks around. She tries to redress him. She talks to him a little bit. She doesn't leave the pillory until after the archdeacon has approached Quasimodo and has started freeing him from his shackles. Again, the biggest problem I had with Esmeralda in the novel is that she just couldn't get past Quasimodo's appearance, and there's so much room for their relationship to grow. Here, we get to see them interact a lot more. They're friends. Esmeralda's not afraid to touch him, or talk to him, or even pet his head as a way to thank him for saving her life. You know, they have a very sweet relationship. I really enjoy watching it.
He's like a puppy.
Does a puppy throw his master off the roof?
A dog will protect his master, and you know what? Jehan loses the status of being Quasimodo's master fairly early on. You talked about Quasimodo snarling at him and scaring him off after the pillory scene. Quasimodo switches to the Archdeacon and Esmeralda pretty quickly.
Like I said, he has a lot more self-respect in this incarnation.
He has a lot of self-respect, but he's not delusional to the point where he thinks Esmeralda's actually going to be in love with him. He will protect her and will ring the bells in her honor, expressing his wild joy in the only way he knows. But he wants Esmeralda to be happy, and that includes supporting her relationship with Captain Phoebus, who, like in the Esmeralda opera, and I see a lot of similarities between this adaptation and the Esmeralda opera libretto. It might be a coincidence, but there were a zillion adaptations on the stage in the 19th century that followed very similar tropes to that adaptation. This is the heroic Phoebus, and this movie kind of feels like the last of those melodramatic plays and operas from the 1800s, where you have secularized Frollos and heroic Phoebuses that are actually in love with Esmeralda. But, and here's my hot take, I think Phoebus might be the most developed character in this adaptation. Unlike in the Esmeralda opera by Louise Bertin, he has an arc. He starts off as a cad, but gradually realizes, hey, I shouldn't take advantage of women, right? All women are queens. Esmeralda is someone I should respect and give her the patience that she deserves.
All women are queens. Does that include his fiancée? Because Fleur-de-Lis, like in the book, is introduced as Phoebus's fiancée. We see them flirting with each other and, playing around with each other during the first and really only scene that she's in this movie. And then he completely abandons her for this other chick named Esmeralda. We don't see them break up. He invites Esmeralda to a ball that his fiancé's aunt is holding in his honor, and fully says at that ball, in front of his fiancée and her aunt, "Esmeralda, did you not promise to be my bride?" Did he break up with Fleur-de-Lis at some point in this movie? We don't see that.
Yeah, he was looking to upgrade. But, he feels bad at one point and shows some remorse and tries to be more noble and heroic rather than a cad. Even in Fleur-de-Lis' first scene with Phoebus, she remarks that you would say as much to any woman. So Phoebus has a character arc, and I think the heroic Phoebus in this version is earned, even though, like any version where you're going to keep the idea of him cheating on his fiancée, maybe not the most ideal romantic relationship, but it's something. It's kind of like Titanic, where, you're crossing the class boundaries, and that's so romantic that you almost forget that, wait a minute, weren't you going to get married and have a stable life?
Yeah, right after Phoebus rescues Esmeralda from Quasimodo, he takes her to this seedy tavern called Eve's Apple. Get it? Apple, seedy? Anyway, it's the same name as the tavern from the book. And as they walk in, we see a shot of a moth caught in a spider's web, which is imagery from the novel. However, in the novel, that imagery is used to represent Frollo and Esmeralda. Here, it's used to represent Phoebus and Esmeralda, and they're sitting in this tavern, and he's looking at her like he's trying to imagine her without her clothes on, and he reaches over and pulls down her shirt sleeve and exposes her entire shoulder. I know the dudes in 1923 went crazy over that shot. My goodness. But then Esmeralda starts talking about her long-lost mother and talking about her status as an orphan, and we see shame flood Phoebus's face, and he returns her sleeve to her shoulder and gets up and offers to escort her home. You're right, Patrick, we do get to see Phoebus having his first taste of respect women juice. He does have a character arc, and that's why I agree that their reunion at the very end of the movie, when he rushes into the cathedral and walks off with her, I think that's earned as well. And I think Quasimodo would agree with me. As he is actively dying from being stabbed by his former master, he looks up and he sees that Esmeralda is in the arms of a knight in shining armor. And rather than lament this, rather than say, oh, of course she's in love with a man who is 10 times more handsome than I'll ever be, the look on his face, at least this is how I interpreted it, tells me that Quasimodo was happy in that moment, thinking, oh, thank God there's someone who loves Esmeralda who's going to take care of her after I'm gone.
You mentioned Esmeralda's long-lost mother. That was a subplot from the book where Esmeralda was concerned that if she lost her virtue, her virginity, she would not be able to find her mother. That plotline kind of exists in this version. They set it up, but it is resolved extremely quickly.
Yeah. At the beginning of the movie, we see this ragged urchin who lives in this underground cell, yelling at Esmeralda, heckling her, making her afraid. And then we get this woman's entire backstory, which is pretty much the exact same backstory from the novel. The woman believes her daughter was kidnapped and killed by the Romani, and that has morphed into intense prejudice against the Romani. And that is why this woman hates Esmeralda so much. we spend a pretty significant amount of time establishing that backstory, only for this character to run out of her cell while Esmeralda is being brought to the pillory where she is to be executed. The character grabs Esmeralda, accidentally pulls an amulet off of her neck, and realizes, wait a minute, this is the amulet I gave my daughter. Oh my gosh, this young Romani girl is my daughter. Oh, please save her. And then this woman, the sack woman, as she's referred to in the book, just collapses and dies in the street. And that plot line is really never resolved. We never get to see a reunion between Esmeralda and her mom. Esmeralda never finds out that her mom was alive. This woman kind of just dies in the middle of the movie after we spent so much time establishing her backstory. That was really disappointing to me.
All right, so I can't fully defend this subplot about Esmeralda's mother, because even though it's set up well, it ends 2/3 of the way through the story instead of the way it should, and it makes no sense.
And Esmeralda never finds out that her mother was alive the whole time, so what's the point?
I think this was an intentional creative choice. It's not a goof up, it's not the result of a bunch of lost footage, maybe just a small amount of lost footage. This was intentional. You know how earlier I mentioned that the guy who wrote the screenplay also wrote a novelization of the movie? This novelization is an interesting read. And in that novelization, Purely Poor Sheehan argues, oh, Gudule dies, but before she dies, she prays that God will watch over her daughter, aka Esmeralda, and will deliver her from evil and save her.
That makes sense, because when Esmeralda is being attacked by Jehan during the siege of Notre Dame, and he's trying to force himself on her, he says, why do you struggle? And she says, God will protect me. So that's a thread that is being pulled throughout the film then. And in this case, I guess, Quasimodo would function as the will of God, like he does in the novel.
If we take the novelization as canon, Quasimodo is literally sent by God.
Yeah, the sack woman says, help my daughter. Quasimodo answers the call and helps Esmeralda. And later, when Esmeralda is being attacked by Jehan, she says, God will protect me. Quasimodo runs right in and fights Jehan off of her. So yeah, in this movie, Quasimodo is functioning as the will of God. He's kind of like an angel.
Here's what Sheehan writes in the novelization. There he turned and held her aloft. His rusty voice bellowed out like the clang of a long-neglected bell. Sanctuary! Sanctuary! It was as if the dying petition of this girl's mother, she who had been known as Sister Gudule, had reached the throne of God.
And speaking of Esmeralda's parents, she has a father in this movie. In the novel, Clopin is the king of the beggars, and he refers to Esmeralda as a sister, but I don't think he has any close personal relationship with her. He refers to her as a sister, probably in the way that he would refer to any female member of the Court of Miracles as a sister. In this movie, Clopin is Esmeralda's adoptive father. The title cards tell us that he bought her when she was very young, which in the world of this movie might be the way Quasimodo became Jehan's slave. Maybe Jehan also bought him. It's really cool to see Clopin in the role of a father. I feel a lot of adaptations don't really know what to do with his character. I mean, in our previous episode, we talked about the opera La Esmeralda, in which Clopin is Frollo's lackey and student in sorcery, but we never really get to see that fleshed out. In the Disney movie, he's kind of a narrator / master of ceremonies, kind of like the MC from Cabaret. He plays a different role in every different adaptation, but I really like his role here. Not only is he sort of the father of everyone in the Court of Miracles. He is the king of the beggars. He dreams of lifting his people out of poverty and initiating a revolution against the oppressive French aristocracy. He is also Esmeralda's dad, and he has a soft spot for her. I mean, she's probably the only person who can convince him, hey, take that noose off of that guy you're about to hang. I don't care if you think he's an aristocratic spy. Have you so little misery that you must create more?
And going with characters whose relationships are changed from the novel, you mentioned the guy who gets cut down. That's Gringoire, right? Gringoire is Captain Phoebus's sidekick for a lot of the movie. I don't know how they know each other. Granted, most of the scenes with Gringoire are lost to time. He had a lot more to do in the script, and in the movie that we have today, he's a fairly minor role. He nearly gets hanged in the Court of Miracles. He sits around during the festival scene. He delivers messages to Captain Phoebus, and he's very hungry. There's a really funny scene after Gringoire delivers a romantic message from Esmeralda to Phoebus, where Phoebus is so love-struck, he just wants to keep talking about Esmeralda. And poor Gringoire, who is a starving poet, literally a starving artist, is lustfully looking after a chicken and just keeps getting interrupted as soon as he wants to start eating. It's classic silent comedy. I think Phoebus and Gringoire make a good pair comedically. They don't really interact in the novel, but I think there's some potential. I hope other adaptations play with that character dynamic.
Handsome knight in shining armor who is completely head over heels in love with a beautiful maiden, and this lanky, bumbling idiot sidekick who, oh, sir, yes, sir, I'll do whatever you say. Kind of like Gaston and Le Fou, but a lot healthier.
Now, in the screenplay, there were excerpts from Gringoire's poems, and he had a lot more to do. He was very involved with a character who gets a title card in the movie we have today, but doesn't do anything. Marie, the Queen of the Romani, who's not from the book.
Yeah, Marie, Queen of the Romani. She is introduced with her own title card. We see her at one point comforting Esmeralda after the ball scene where Esmeralda realizes she and Phoebus can't be together because of their differing economic classes. Does she have a lot more to do in the footage that's cut? Because it seems as though she's set up to have a larger role than she ultimately does.
Yeah, same with the Archdeacon and Gringoire, and frankly the King of France, who barely has any scenes.
He's in this twice, I think. Once during the Festival of Fools scene, and once when he promotes Phoebus to Captain of the Guards, which it's really cool that we actually get to see Phoebus promoted in this movie.
Well, most of the King's scenes were in that treasure subplot, so when they go, he goes.
Is there a place where our listeners can read this screenplay online for free? It seems like it includes a lot of really interesting information about this movie that might not be available through more conventional outlets like YouTube.
Not necessarily. The screenplay was preserved in book form in the 80s by Philip J. Riley, who preserved a lot of Universal screenplays for movies featuring the macabre and the supernatural. You know, Quasimodo is, in his own way, the first Universal monster. Without the success of this movie, you wouldn't have had the Phantom of the Opera, or Dracula, or Frankenstein, or The Mummy. And that book is long out of print. It was bundled with Patsy Ruth Miller's memoirs as a small press book in the 80s, and is very expensive even today. But about a decade ago, it looks like another independent publisher got the rights to that copy of the screenplay, which is the director's personal copy, Wallace Worsley's, with his notes and his X's and little details in the margins. You can still get that today. So as for where you can get it for free, I can't really help you with that right now, even though the screenplay is obviously in the public domain. It's more than 100 years old.
Yeah, it's not often you get to talk about a film that's over 100 years old.
And everyone in this movie is dead.
Even that little girl in the Sackwoman Esmeralda flashback scene is probably dead. Her children are probably dead. Ugh.
That's a bummer. I think Bear Manor Press sells the screenplay, so if you want to get a copy and see some of these deleted scenes, you can find them there. There's a ton of little scenes that we haven't mentioned. This would be a 3-hour podcast if we talked about everything that is missing from this movie and all the publicity. There are scenes of Quasimodo bartering with a merchant to get some clothing for Esmeralda after she gets saved in Notre-Dame. And there are a lot of great photographs of these missing scenes, but just look around Google, you'll see pictures, and if you see something that doesn't look like a scene from the movie, it's probably a deleted scene.
There are a couple moments of violence that completely cut away from what we probably should be focusing on, and then cut back once the violence is over. And by that I mean, we don't actually see the whip hitting Quasimodo's back, but we see the torturer holding the whip over his head. We cut away for a moment, and then we see Quasimodo crying out in pain. It's the same with Phoebus's stabbing. We see Jehan lunging out and raising the dagger over Phoebus, and then we cut to the interior of Notre Dame for a moment, and then we cut to Phoebus collapsing onto the ground while Jehan runs away. Those little moments of violence, save for the moment Quasimodo gets stabbed, are omitted from this movie. There, like you said, Patrick, there were censorship concerns at the time, and those really difficult moments of violence that Victor Hugo paints so beautifully and so gruesomely in his novel, we can't see those visually in this movie.
There are those limitations, but I think they're done rather tastefully. You don't need to see the cat-o'-nine-tails strike against Quasimodo's hump and then gore the pavement with blood like it does in the novel. We're able to put 2 and 2 together, and even though we don't see Quasimodo get whipped, I feel as the audience, it's as if we do see it, just because of the reactions. We see, someone raises a whip, then in the next shot, they cringe and scream. We feel it more than if we actually saw the violence. It's like how in Jaws, you don't actually see the shark so much, but you do hear the score and you see the POV and people talk about the shark. It builds up suspense. And with Phoebus being stabbed, when we cut to the interior of Notre Dame, that's not just a random cut. It's a shot of Quasimodo blowing out a candle, as if he is blowing out Phoebus's life after he gets stabbed. So I think that's a clever way to censor and cut around the violence. So yes, it is tamer than Hugo's novel, but I think if you are going to show the wimpy version, it's tastefully done. It's a lot more tastefully done than the censorship of, say, oh geez, you ever seen The Big Lebowski?
Indeed, I have, multiple times.
Well, that's a movie that has a lot of foul language, and you can't show that on TV at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So all of the swear words had to be redubbed. And let me just say, in the original cut of the film, John Goodman's character did not say, "That's what happens when you find a stranger in the Alps." I will leave it at that. That's the sort of uncouth and awkward censorship that this movie avoids and is able to do rather tastefully.
But for some reason, for all of this censorship, we do get to see Jehan plunging a dagger into Quasimodo's back. I guess because deformed people don't deserve the same level of sensitivity and censorship that other people do? ?
I know, it's one thing to show a knife going into a handsome guy's back, like that's too much. But a hump?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably just hollow in there. You can smack it, it'll make like a bongo sound. Thump.
It must not be hollow, because Quasimodo dies in this version. Whereas Phoebus, he gets full-on stabbed and he's completely fine.
Yeah, totally fine. Just walks off with the woman of his dreams on his arm, and yay, we can be together now because your dad is dead.
Maybe it's because the actor playing Phoebus was made of wood. I don't think Norman Kerry's a terrible actor, but I also don't think that he enjoyed acting very much.
He looks a heck of a lot like Orlando Bloom, in my opinion, so he's got that working for him.
In real life, Norman Kerry was sort of like Phoebus from the novel, just very handsome and an airhead. And in contrast to Lon Chaney, who took his craft as an art, he took being an actor very seriously. Norman Kerry was more about, all right, don't look at the camera, don't giggle during the love scenes, and don't forget to pick up your check on Friday. Norman Kerry did not last very long in the era of sound movies once that technology gets invented, because, oh dear, Now I have to do more than be a pretty face. But you know, he's pretty good at being a pretty face in this version.
There's a story I love. Norman Kerry was also in Universal's film adaptation of The Phantom of the Opera that Lon Chaney starred in. And yes, listener, Lon Chaney did his own makeup for that one too. On the set of that movie, Norman Kerry said something to the effect of, "I became an actor so that I wouldn't have to get a real job." And Lon Chaney was just absolutely disgusted by this. And well, there's a reason why we're still talking about Lon Chaney as one of the greatest actors and makeup artists who ever lived today, and you don't really hear Norman Kerry's name said aloud. Patrick, before we wrap up here, what are your overall thoughts on Universal's The Hunchback of Notre Dame?
I really like this movie. It is not just a good first silent movie, it's one of the most important movies, period. It helped to make Universal a legitimate player in the film business. It made Lon Chaney a internationally recognized superstar, and it blew up the name The Hunchback of Notre Dame. You know, before then, yes, there had been translations of the novel that used the term Hunchback of Notre Dame, and they had been used interchangeably throughout the 19th century, but this movie being such a big hit and inspiring so many movies after it really solidifies that in the English-speaking world, Notre-Dame de Paris, for better or for worse, is the Hunchback of Notre Dame. And as iconic and important as this movie is, I'm willing to admit that it does have a few flaws. You know, Wallace Worsley is not an amazing director. We do not have the same creative shots that you might have in, for example, a lot of German silent films at the time, like Der Golem or Nosferatu or other such macabre films. But the strengths of this film, visually, are the sets, costumes, and actors. I love looking at this movie. The strengths of this film, visually, are the sets, costumes, and actors. I love looking at this movie. The costumes are so good and the sets are so believable. I think that I am looking at footage of the Middle Ages, even though this is only 100 years ago. It is fantastic to look at, just as a world. I love being in the world of this movie. Even if the plot doesn't always connect super well, it's a lot of this happens and then this happens and then that happens versus plot point A, therefore plot point B, therefore plot point C. It's very meandering, especially in the first half, but the action is good. I enjoy the characterizations, and Lon Chaney's performance as Quasimodo is simply unforgettable. So I'm not going to promise that the average moviegoer is going to have the ideal experience, but if you do see this movie, and you should, try to see it live with an audience where you have musicians playing alongside the film, maybe with a small orchestra, or I was privileged enough to see, alongside Leslie, a playing of this film with the Wurlitzer organ, which is basically like a one-man band in the form of a piano. It was great. There were sound effects, there was clapping, there was bells. It was an amazing experience. And seeing a silent movie with a live audience is the way to go. There are plenty of over-the-top moments. For example, when Jehan is up to no good, he will lift his cape in front of his face like Dracula. That's a relic from the days of melodrama in the theater. It doesn't really belong in the movies, but boy, is it funny. But when you see a character doing stuff like that, or the very over-the-top love scenes between Phoebus and Esmeralda, see it with a live audience. So when you see the bad guy being bad, people boo and hiss. When you see the love scenes, people say ah. When you see Quasimodo defending the cathedral, people cheer, right? Silent movies were never silent. This movie was designed to be a super jewel, a crowd pleaser. It's the Hollywood version of Hugo's novel. And you know what? I don't mind a bit of Hollywood now and then. Where are you at, Leslie?
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Patrick. And shout out to the Empire State Theater and Musical Instrument Museum, which is where you and I saw this movie played with live accompaniment from a gentleman from Michigan on the Wurlitzer organ, which is unfortunately a dying instrument. There are only a handful of people left in the world who know how to play it. We were privileged that one of them played for a showing just about an hour away from where we live. It was such a wonderful experience. He played an original accompaniment that he wrote by himself for this movie specifically. It was really great to hear his artistry and talk to him after the screening. And you're right, seeing movies live with a live audience is such a special experience, and it's why I pray to God every single day that movie theaters stay in business and they stay full. So, listener, keep an eye on your local happenings. If something like this is happening within driving distance of you, please go see it. It is such a fun experience. But even if you can't, this movie is available for free on YouTube. That is one of the many privileges of us covering something that is in the public domain. You guys can take an hour and 40 minutes and watch it wherever, whenever, without paying a dime. I respect this movie so much for everything it accomplishes. It fixes all of the problems that I, and I'm sure many other readers, had with Victor Hugo's Esmeralda. It brings Lon Chaney's artistry to the character of Quasimodo, which is just a match made in heaven. Without Quasimodo, like you said, Patrick, there wouldn't be Universal monsters. We wouldn't have Frankenstein or the Phantom of the Opera or the Mummy or the Wolfman. And without Lon Chaney and Irving Thalberg, we would not have this movie, which was a huge risk to Universal at the time. It was a Super Jewel production, one of the most expensive films ever made. There are an incalculable number of extras in this movie with elaborate sets and beautiful costumes, and that risk paid off. This is still a very highly talked about film 103 years later, and I am so excited to continue revisiting this film throughout my life. Is it my favorite Hunchback adaptation? No. But I do enjoy it, and I think it's a very interesting watch, and it's a fantastic relic of Hollywood history. Pat, before we wrap up here, it's time for our game we like to play at the end of every episode. Out of everyone and everything we discussed today, who or what would you, A, meet at the inn, B, turn to dust with, and C, throw off of Notre Dame?
I would meet the zesty fellow who appears at Madame de Gondelarier's ball. He is, a portly guy. He's the fat guy with the mustache who gets really offended when the vagabonds enter, and he's very prissy and upset by what's going on.
Yeah, listener, go watch the movie. You'll know exactly who we're talking about.
Can I say zesty on this show?
You could say obviously gay. There's nothing wrong with that. I've never heard a gay man described as zesty. That's a great word.
Critics like Michael F. Blake believe this character is a gay stereotype, and you shouldn't stereotype people. However, I think I would get along with this guy, so we're going to the end. As for who I'm turning to dust with, I'll turn to dust with this version of Clopin, because the revolution will not be televised. I appreciate his over-the-top Eastern European appearance. He has this great action about him and a sense of menace. Ernest Torrance, who plays Clopin, is perfect as a silent film actor. I'm turning to dust with him, not just because I found him interesting as an actor, but because of his softness towards Esmeralda. Clopin's heart burned to the injustice of the world and softened only at the thought of his foster daughter. That's a trope I like, where you have the big tough guy who's soft for the one person he cares about, which appears in several ways in Hugo's novel and in this story. And Clopin definitely embodies that in this version. As for who I'm throwing off of Notre Dame, listen, I tried to defend the creative choices with this character by going outside of the movie itself and going to the screenplay and the official novelization. But even with quasi-canon explanations, I can't justify the subplot with Esmeralda's mother. So Sister Gajul, you don't do anything. Even though the actress does a good job and I like those scenes, the fact that she dies 2/3 into the movie with no resolution on screen just leaves me as an audience member wondering, what is the point? Why are we sitting here and watching this? Is this just pathos for the sake of pathos? So, you know what? And she's being thrown off of Notre Dame with an explanation. The explanation being, in the movie, she didn't get one for why she dies. Where are you falling on this game, old Leslie?
Hopefully not off of Notre Dame. I am going to meet the treasure of Notre Dame at the inn. Partially because I like shiny things. You know, Patrick just gave me this beautiful diamond engagement ring. Lab grown, of course, no blood diamonds on my hands. So more of this, please. That would be wonderful. But also because I want to get to know the treasure of Notre Dame. What are you? What was your purpose in this story supposed to be? I would love to get to know that, so I'm going to take the treasure to the inn for a nice date, where I stare at it while it sparkles in the candlelight.
Based on the surviving photographs of the scenes talking about the treasure of Notre Dame, it looks like a single treasure chest with like 3 crowns in it.
I'm going to turn to dust with Irving Thalberg. He seems like a very sweet guy. You know, I have a lot of pity for the image of this little sickly boy with his nose pressed to the window, wishing he could go out and play with his friends. But instead, he makes friends out of books, and he's cuddled up in bed with maybe a stuffed animal or two, and The Hunchback of Notre Dame by Victor Hugo. I don't know who thought to give that to a child. I have a couple questions for his mom, but thank God she did, because thanks to his insistence that this movie not only get made, but receive a massive budget, we have this visual spectacle that we know and love today. And this movie did change Universal. So thank you, Irving Thalberg. I'm going to turn to dust with you, my friend. As for who I'm throwing off of Notre Dame, I'm going to take whoever lost the 20 minutes of footage of this movie that we will probably never get to see, and I'm throwing them right onto the pavement, and they're gonna go splat. I wish we saw more of Marie, Queen of the Romani. I wish we found out what the heck this treasure of Notre Dame actually was. There is so much of this movie that, thanks to your historical insight, Patrick, I didn't know I needed to see. So I'm going to find that person who just didn't think those scenes were worth preserving after they tumbled to the cutting room floor, and I'm throwing him off of the cathedral.
And with that, another episode of the Hunchcast comes to a close. Clothes? Shirt? Socks?
There are a lot of clothes in this movie, and there are going to be a lot of clothes in the next movie we're covering. Listener, tune in next time to see what that is. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Hunchcast. Ring that notification bell to be automatically updated when new episodes are released. For free bonus content, and to share your thoughts with us, follow us on Instagram, Tumblr, and TikTok at The Hunchcast. The Hunchcast of Notre Dame is a production of 1482 Media. All rights reserved.